You can set a clear goal with full sincerity and still not get the result you want. Sometimes that looks like a path you know is right, one you commit to, build it, and even launch. And yet the thing never fully gathers the life it needs to sustain itself. The idea is real, the work is real, and you follow the inspiration, you do what you know you need to do, and still the deeper momentum never quite arrives. Other times the split shows up from the opposite direction. You know something is over, or too small, or no longer true, and yet you keep finding yourself inside it anyway. This is Wisdom versus Wallpaper. I'm Kevin Allen Kerber. A lot of people know one version of that gap or the other. Some know both. In one case, you cannot get full life behind what feels deeply aligned. In the other, you cannot seem to stop feeding what you already know no longer fits. Either way, the confusion is the same. The intention is real. The visible effort may be substantial, yet something underneath keeps directing energy elsewhere. Today, I want to look closely at that split, because most people explain it too quickly as weakness or inconsistency or failure. I think something deeper is usually organizing the outcome. This episode is about the gap we just named, the one where you know what you want, mean it sincerely, put real effort behind it, and still watch the deeper support never fully arrive. That pattern holds even when the goal feels honest and the work feels honest. And most usual explanations of fear or inconsistency, self-sabotage, lack of discipline only touch the surface. What I want to look at today is the possibility that behavior is often being directed below the level of conscious choice. You may be trying to build a life with one part of yourself, while another part is still organized around rules you never deliberately chose. Beliefs about life that are so transparent, you see right through them without noticing that they're there. That matters for this whole series because the sayings we've been examining do more than oversimplify life. They help install those rules. They reinforce them. They make certain ways of seeing feel natural, moral, obvious, even wise, long before anyone stops to ask where those ideas came from or whether they still deserve authority. I know this territory better than I'd like to. I know what it is to feel a full body yes, follow it seriously, and still watch the momentum thin out in ways that make no sense on the surface. The failure starts looking like evidence against you. Culture piles on with work harder, commit more fully, believe more, stop sabotaging yourself. All of that lands on people who are already trying with all they know to do. That is where the usual diagnosis starts to fail. A lot of what gets called self-sabotage are outdated old beliefs still doing their job, limiting ideas. A clear choice does not automatically cancel an old contract. That could be hard to accept because it means sincerity is not always enough to reroute a life. So before we reduce the stall in momentum to weakness or failure of faith, let's look at what is really happening underneath. One version of this split gets talked about a lot, knowing something is wrong for you and still having trouble leaving it. That matters, for sure, it's real. But there's another version that can be even more disorienting, and it's the one I really want to stay with here. You feel a genuine yes around something. The idea is not casual. It feels aligned, alive, well timed, and you move toward it seriously. You do the work, you build the thing, you make the calls, you take all the steps, you launch the project, you follow that inspiration and give it what honestly feels like your very best. From the outside, it may even have all the markings of something real and thoughtful, well made, and ready. And still, it doesn't fully land. The life doesn't gather around it the way you expected. It doesn't attract what it needs. The energy just doesn't consolidate. The momentum thins out instead of building. What looked like a living path starts feeling rough, underfunded, strangely unsupported, or hard to sustain in ways that don't make sense when you look at it from the visible effort. That is a brutal experience because it doesn't look like lack of sincerity. Once you have followed the yes with real effort, the mind starts looking for somewhere to put the gap. Some people stay with the external story. The timing was wrong. The market wasn't ready. The support just wasn't there. And sometimes that is simply true. But at some point, if the pattern keeps repeating across different circumstances, the external explanation starts to feel incomplete. And when a person finally stops pointing outward, the only remaining direction is inward. The mind starts trying to explain the gap in the only way it can. Maybe I wasn't good enough, or my best just wasn't enough. Maybe the whole thing only felt aligned because I wanted it to. I must have missed something. Maybe I sabotaged it without even knowing. What I think is happening in a lot of these situations is deeper than the usual explanations allow for. Sometimes the visible effort is not the problem. The person may be doing a great deal right on the surface, while something deeper keeps siphoning force away from that goal. That is where internal rules become useful as a framework. What unseen rule, belief, is getting priority? By internal rules, I mean the old, often unperceived agreements, the beliefs that have been formed and often not even examined. These shape perception. They direct attention and determine where energy goes before a conscious goal ever gets much authority. Most people do not experience them as rules. They feel more like common sense, reality, instinct, preference, caution, personality. But they are doing specific work. They are deciding what feels safe, what feels dangerous, what deserves attention, and what gets funded first, and what seems possible to a person at all. That is why behavior is so often organized by something deeper than the stated goal. Life force follows established pathways. Energy does not automatically move toward whatever the conscious mind has most recently decided at once, no matter how aligned it may be. It moves through what the system already recognizes as established, binding, or necessary to preserve. Until those pathways are examined, energy keeps flowing according to old agreements, not current ones. These ingrained beliefs have a lien on your creative energy. The older contract gets paid first in time, first in line. A person may consciously want to lose weight, get stronger, feel better, and come back into a relationship with their own body. The desire is real. The effort may be consistent too. They can do the planning, buy the food, follow the program, make the schedule, even get some good early results. But if there is a deeper belief, one they are not even aware that they're running, that they're holding on to, that says becoming healthier will cost them love or belonging, familiarity or safety, then the system is not dealing with one goal. It is dealing with two competing contracts. The new contract in your awareness says, get healthier. The older one, embedded in your subconscious and nervous system, says, if you improve too much, you may lose people. If that second rule has emotional history behind it, if the person has actually lived some version of that loss before or have seen it, then it carries weight. It does not have to be fully conscious in order to dominate. In fact, the most powerful rules usually aren't. The person may have no idea that part of them links improvement with exile, or visibility with criticism, or success with relational loss. All they know is that the surface effort never seems to become full support. That is not trivial. That is a structural drain. And once you start looking this way, you can see the same structure in a lot of places. Someone may want to become more visible in their work while still carrying an older agreement that being seen invites attack. Another person may want financial expansion, while an inherited rule still says earning more creates disloyalty, envy, or danger. Someone else may consciously choose a healthier relationship, while a deeper part of the system still treats familiarity as safer than honesty. Those older agreements do not disappear because a better idea shows up. A new decision does not automatically cancel an old contract. That is the split. And it explains why surface effort alone often fails to change the outcome. The problem is not always that the person is doing too little. In some cases, they are doing a lot, everything. The real issue is that the visible effort is being underfunded by a system still loyal to something older. Now, the person is no longer trapped between two brutal explanations. Either the dream was false or I am. A third possibility appears. The desire may be true, the effort may be real. The lack of traction may be showing you exactly where older agreements still have priority. That is different information. It does not erase responsibility, but it does replace shame with structure. I want to be careful here because nothing I've said is meant to suggest that effort plus the right inner architecture guarantees an outcome. It doesn't. Timing is real. Market conditions are real. Resources matter. Luck exists. Some ideas arrive before the world is ready for them. Some genuinely good work simply doesn't find its moment. And that is not always a story about internal blockage. Life has problems that cannot be solved from the inside. What I'm pointing at is something more specific. It is the pattern that follows a person from one attempt to the next. The stall that shows up regardless of the external conditions. The drain that happens even when the circumstances are favorable. That is the territory where internal rules are worth examining. Not every failure, not every rough patch, the reoccurring one, the one that keeps finding you. And once the structure starts coming into view, the person can ask a far better question than, why is this failing for me? They can ask, what is my system protecting? How about this? What belief could someone be holding that would support such difficulty? Once people start hearing language like internal rules, one of the first questions is whether they chose them. Usually they didn't. That matters because a lot of shame begins to loosen the moment a person realizes they are living inside patterns they never consciously sat down and approved. Most of these agreements were already in place long before deliberate choice entered the picture. They were picked up through repetition, family atmosphere, cultural pressure, identity, survival, and all the little adjustments a person makes while trying to stay safe, loved, included, or understandable to the people around them. A great deal of this gets learned without anyone ever saying it plainly. Nobody has to sit a child down and explain that peace matters more than truth, or that being visible comes with a cost, or that love is earned by being useful. The system teaches it anyway. A person grows up watching what earns approval, what creates tension, who gets ignored, who gets rewarded, and what draws criticism, what brings closeness, and what makes the room tighten. Over time, the body starts organizing around those lessons, whether or not the person ever names them. Culture builds on top of that. It hands people ready-made ideas about success, worth, beauty, ambition, respectability, power, gender, age, productivity, and belonging. A person can think they are making individual choices while carrying a whole set of assumptions absorbed years earlier about what kind of life is acceptable, what kind of desire is admirable, and how much space they are allowed to take up without paying for it somehow. Identity plays its part too. If somebody grows up as the responsible one, the helper, the outsider, the strong one, the easy one, the difficult one, the talented one, or the overlooked one, that role can stop being just a description and become an agreement. The person begins organizing around what they believe they are allowed to be. Then later, when life asks for something outside that role, the movement can feel strangely difficult, even when the new direction is healthier, truer, and more aligned with who they are now. Survival is where this starts making the deepest sense. A rule that once helped someone survive does not feel optional while it is still doing its job. If staying quiet kept conflict down, the system remembers that. If being agreeable reduced danger, it remembers that too. If overachieving earned safety, or staying useful prevented abandonment, or reading the room quickly helped avoid humiliation, those strategies can settle in so deeply that years later they stop looking like adaptation and start feeling like personality. That does not mean every old rule came from some extreme or dramatic backstory. A lot of them came from ordinary human environments that were simply pressured, conditional, emotionally uneven, competitive, rigid, or quietly unsafe in ways nobody talked about directly. People do not need a catastrophic history to end up loyal to agreements they never consciously chose. Repetition under emotional weight is often enough. Take the person who learned somewhere early that being seen comes with a cost. They may have talent, ambition, and a real sense of calling. They may even know exactly what they want to build. But each time they get close to fuller visibility, the energy starts rerouting. The project remains real. The desire remains real. What gets underfunded is the life force needed to carry it all the way through, because an older agreement still links visibility with scrutiny, envy, criticism, or loss of safety. Your system funds what feels established before it funds what feels new. That does not mean the old rule is more true. It means it has more history, more repetition, and more emotional backing behind it. That is why some rules were absorbed without consent and keep directing energy long after the original conditions are gone. And once that becomes clear, the whole conversation changes. A person no longer has to treat every hesitation, stall, or split in momentum as proof that they are broken, lazy, unserious, or incapable. They can begin looking with more respect and more precision at what the system has been protecting and why. Some of those protections may still be useful. Others may be long overdue for revision and renegotiation. Either way, the work becomes more humane the moment a person stops misreading old protection as present-day failure. This is where the sayings start to matter in a more serious way. Up to now, they may have sounded like surface language, little phrases people repeat without much thought. But once you understand internal rules, those sayings stop looking harmless. They start looking like delivery systems. They carry assumptions into the mind in a form that feels familiar, reasonable, and easy to accept. A platitude can be very short and still hold a whole worldview inside it. A few ordinary words quietly tell a person what's admirable, what's dangerous, what feelings are acceptable, what effort proves worth, and what life counts as successful. The sentence sounds simple because it's compressed. The agreement inside it usually isn't. Once you start hearing that, the importance of examining these phrases becomes obvious. Take follow your passion. It sounds liberating. Sometimes it points to something real. But underneath it can carry a distorted agreement that meaningful work should feel clear, emotionally charged, and fulfilling almost all the time. When the path gets hard, boring, or inconsistent, people question the path instead of seeing ordinary friction. Or, love means never having to say you're sorry. Versions of that idea still linger. Underneath is an agreement that true closeness makes repair unnecessary, that being understood cancels accountability, or that naming harm cheapens intimacy. That can train people to tolerate too much and mistrust their own need for responsibility. Money sayings like, money can't buy happiness, sound morally clean, but they can quietly dismiss ambition or relief. A person wants more stability or choice while carrying an inherited suspicion that expansion corrupts or distances. When success nears, the system reroutes because the older rule claims moral priority. Health and hustle culture do this constantly. Nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. Rise and grind. Sleep when you're dead. These train attention toward control, output, and external approval while sounding disciplined. They shape identity more than behavior. These catchy phrases do more than decorate culture. They help build the inner architecture people live from, because they usually arrive with emotional weight. During hope, confusion, loneliness, heartbreak, ambition, or shame, they go in deeper than people realize. The phrase gets repeated enough that it stops feeling like language and starts feeling like common sense. After that, common sense hardens into internal reality. That is the moment this show is interested in. A person stops hearing the sentence as an idea and begins living as though it were simply how life works. That is when the saying becomes powerful enough to shape choices, attention, and self-perception without ever announcing itself as a rule. You are no longer asking whether the sentence sounds clever or comforting. You start asking what kind of life it organizes, what behavior it rewards, and what truth it makes harder to tell. This is where things start getting lighter. And I don't mean easier in some glossy, instant way. I mean, the person finally has something real to work with. Up to this point, the rule does not feel like a rule. It feels like reality. It feels like common sense, or good judgment, maturity, caution, loyalty, practicality, self-protection, or just, it's the way I am. That is part of what gives it so much power. A person doesn't experience it as one pattern among many. They experience it as the obvious truth of the situation. So the old agreement keeps shaping what gets attention, what gets funded, what feels available, and what quietly gets dismissed before it has had chance to gather. That is why visibility matters so much. When the rule becomes visible, its charge begins to dissolve. I don't mean it vanishes in one dramatic moment. I mean something important loosens. The person is no longer completely fused with the pattern. There's a little space now. What used to feel like unquestioned reality starts to look more like an organized response, something that formed under certain conditions and kept running because it never had to identify itself. Once that happens, the whole atmosphere changes. The person is still in contact with the old pull, but they are no longer trapped inside a bad diagnosis of themselves. Take someone who has spent years trying to build something of their own and repeatedly watching the life go out of it. Before the deeper rule comes into view, the pattern looks like inconsistency. They tell themselves they need to focus, get disciplined, stop drifting, stop leaking energy. Every attempt that stalls adds more shame, and the shame makes the next attempt heavier. Then at some point, the rule becomes visible. Maybe what has actually been running is not laziness or lack of seriousness at all. Maybe being fully seen has never felt safe. Maybe visibility got linked somewhere much earlier with criticism, punishment, scrutiny, envy, or loss of belonging. Now the struggle makes different sense. The person is still responsible for their life, but they are no longer trying to solve the problem with the wrong name. That is the beginning of relief, because once the rule is named, the stall stops being a proof of failure and starts becoming information. A person can finally ask what the system has been protecting instead of wasting all their energy trying to beat themselves into motion. Shame loses some of its authority the moment structure enters the room. What was automatic becomes optional. That line sounds compact, but in lived experience, it is huge. Before the rule is visible, the pattern fires so fast it feels like fact. The opportunity appears. The old pathway collects the energy, and the reroute feels immediate, justified, and familiar. Once the rule is visible, that same pull may still happen, but it is no longer the same as law. There is a pause now. The person can feel the old route trying to take over and recognize it for what it is. That does not mean the fear disappears. It means the fear is no longer the only voice in the room. That is where optionality begins. And optional rules restore agency. Agency, in the way I mean it here, is quiet. It is not a performance of competence. It is not somebody standing on a mountain talking about empowerment. It is the return of real choice in places where there used to be compulsion. A person can finally say, I understand why this rule is formed, and I can also see that it is not the whole truth of who I am now. That is a very different inner position from trying to overpower yourself. You can feel the difference in practical ways. The person who used to disappear the moment something mattered may still feel the pull to vanish, but they can stay visible a little longer. Someone who always rerouted energy into everyone else's emergencies may catch it happening in real time and choose differently for 20 minutes instead of none. A person who automatically treated discomfort as danger may begin to sort the two apart. None of that looks especially glamorous from the outside, but that is how change actually starts becoming trustworthy. And agency restores authorship. That is the larger shift underneath all of this. The person is no longer living from inherited agreements. They begin living from current ones. The question changes. Instead of asking, what is wrong with me? They can ask, what has been running here? And what do I actually want to give authority to now? That move may sound subtle on paper, but it changes the emotional posture of a life. That is why visibility is such a turning point. The old rule may still have force. It may still show up under stress. It may still know exactly how to make its case, but it is no longer invisible. And once something is no longer invisible, it can not dominate in quite the same way. The person has somewhere to stand that is not total identification with the pattern. That alone can change a life. Now the path forward is not built on shame. It is built on clarity. Energy starts consolidating because the conflict underneath the stall has finally been named. Movement begins to feel more natural, not because the person has learned how to bully themselves more efficiently, but because the deeper split is no longer being mistaken for a character flaw. That is where this whole episode has been heading. A person can see what has been organizing them, and in seeing it clearly, start living from somewhere truer. That is the doorway into authorship. Next time, I'll be joined by a guest, because this one coming up deserves a two-sided conversation. We're going to do a deep dive into good vibes only. See you then.